The courtroom was a spectacle of authority and power, where decisions were made, and lives were determined with the cold stroke of a gavel. The air was thick with murmurs, the audience shifting in their seats as they watched the woman standing in the defendant's box. Handcuffed, dressed in the dull orange of the county jail, her face was set in stone, her eyes unflinching as they bore into the man who held her fate in his hands. But despite her calm exterior, the entire room could feel the weight of her humiliation, the tension of an injustice so blatant it made even the most indifferent observer uneasy. Yet, no one spoke. No one dared to challenge the authority sitting atop that bench, draped in black robes, wielding a smirk so smug it was sickening. The judge leaned forward, tapping his fingers rhythmically against the polished wood of his podium, his voice a slow drawl filled with condescension and quiet amusement. "Miss Carter, you are exactly the kind of individual our society needs to be rid of. You are a disgrace to the law, a liar, and a criminal." He let the words hang in the air, watching the reactions in the room, soaking in the satisfaction of knowing no one would come to her defense. He continued, his voice growing sharper, his words cutting deeper. "You resisted arrest, disrespected law enforcement, and you have the audacity to stand here and act as if you're the victim? No, Miss Carter, you belong behind bars." A murmur ran through the gallery, some whispering in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. The prosecutor stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression carefully neutral, though there was no doubt he enjoyed the unfolding spectacle just as much as the judge. The officers who had dragged her into this mess sat to the side, their uniforms crisp, their faces unreadable, but their eyes spoke volumes. They weren't worried. They knew how this would end. The system had always worked in their favor. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't react to the judge's words. Instead, she stood there, her back straight, her chin lifted, her silence more powerful than any argument she could have made. It wasn't the first time she had been judged unfairly, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But this time, something was different. The way the judge smirked as he spoke, the way the prosecutor refused to meet her eyes, the way the officers sat relaxed in their seats, it was all too perfectly orchestrated. This wasn't a trial. It was a performance. The judge sat back, feigning deep contemplation, though his mind had been made up the moment she walked into his courtroom. "I see no reason to entertain any further discussion. The evidence is clear. The testimonies against you are overwhelming." His lips curled as if he were speaking to a child who simply didn't understand their place. "Your claims of self-defense? Laughable. Your accusations against our fine officers? Absurd. You were a threat, and they acted accordingly. Now, it's time for you to face the consequences of your actions." The gavel rose. The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Then, she finally spoke. Her voice was steady, unshaken, cutting through the air like a blade. "Your Honor, before you proceed, I believe you should know exactly who I am." The judge scoffed, shaking his head. "Oh, I know exactly who you are, Miss Carter. You're just another criminal trying to—" "I'm a federal agent," she interrupted, her voice ringing with quiet authority. "With the CIA." Silence. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The judge froze, his mouth slightly open, his face rapidly draining of color. The prosecutor blinked, his body going rigid. The officers, who moments ago looked so confident, exchanged glances, their breathing shallow, their postures stiffening. For the first time, the judge hesitated. For the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. The weight of what she had just said settled over the courtroom like a storm cloud. This was no ordinary defendant. This was not just another case of a black woman being railroaded by the system. She was one of them, someone with power, someone who knew the ins and outs of the law better than they did. And now, they had been caught. The murmurs in the audience turned into gasps, some shifting uncomfortably, others wide-eyed with shock. The reporters in the back scribbled furiously, their lenses zooming in, their fingers hammering on keyboards. The judge swallowed, gripping the edges of his desk. That can't be possible. She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Are you sure about that, Your Honor? He didn't answer. He couldn't. Because in that moment, he knew. Everything was about to change. And what happened next would leave everyone in that room speechless. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, injustice, and discrimination in any form. This story isn't just entertainment, it's a reflection of real struggles that many Black individuals face daily. We believe in justice, empowerment, and the strength of our voices to bring change. If you've ever felt unheard or unfairly judged, know this: you matter. Your voice matters. Your story matters. And we are here to tell stories that not only entertain but also inspire and empower. Now, sit back and enjoy the story. And don't forget, hit that subscribe button and join our community. The fluorescent lights in the county courthouse buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the grand but impersonal courtroom. The air smelled of polished wood, old paper, and the faintest trace of cheap cologne worn by attorneys who had long stopped caring about their cases. The room was designed to command authority, from the towering bookshelves lining the walls to the heavy oak bench where the judge sat, presiding over the lives of those unfortunate enough to stand before him. At the center of it all was Judge Richard Holloway, a man whose presence alone dictated the mood of the room. He was in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with a face carved by years of unchecked power. His skin was weathered from decades of delivering sentences without hesitation, without remorse. His piercing blue eyes held no warmth, only an unwavering confidence in the system he manipulated to his advantage. To him, the courtroom wasn't a place of justice, it was a stage, and he was both the director and the lead actor. Richard came from a long line of judges and politicians, a legacy built on privilege, connections, and an unshakable belief that he was above the very laws he upheld. He had been on the bench for over 20 years, his rulings notorious for favoring the wealthy, the powerful, and, more often than not, those who looked like him. He knew how to play the game, how to twist the law just enough to get what he wanted while maintaining an air of authority. And in cases like this, where the defendant was someone like Jasmine Carter, the game was all too easy. Jasmine stood at the defendant's table, wrists bound in cold steel, her orange jumpsuit stark against her deep brown skin. She was a striking woman, tall, poised, with sharp features that refused to betray the exhaustion she felt. Her dark curls framed her face, her full lips pressed into a firm line. Everything about her demeanor screamed resistance. She was no stranger to adversity, no stranger to fighting against a system designed to keep people like her in chains. But this time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the truth. Born and raised in Baltimore, Jasmine had learned early on that justice was not distributed equally. Her mother had worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, her father had been stopped by police more times than she could count, and she had watched friends disappear into the system, swallowed whole by laws that were never meant to protect them. That was what had driven her to law enforcement, not out of faith in the system, but out of a need to change it. Jasmine had spent the last decade working deep within federal agencies, rising through the ranks with intelligence, precision, and a relentless drive that left no room for error. She had worked undercover, infiltrating corrupt organizations, exposing criminals who thought they were untouchable. But even with all her experience, she had never anticipated becoming the target. She had never imagined she would be the one in the orange jumpsuit, standing before a judge who had already decided her fate before she even walked through the door. The case against her was built on lies, fabricated by officers who had brutalized her in broad daylight. It had started as a simple stop, one she hadn't even seen coming. She had been walking to her car, dressed casually, nothing out of the ordinary. Then came the flashing lights, the aggressive voices, the sudden impact of a baton against her ribs before she even had a chance to react. They had thrown her to the ground, hands digging into her skin, knees pressing against her spine. Resisting arrest, that's what they called it. The video footage had been clear, too clear. It had circulated online, sparking outrage, protests, demands for justice. But in the end, the officers involved hadn't been charged. Instead, she had been. The charges? Obstruction of justice. Assault on an officer. Resisting arrest. False accusations against law enforcement. And now, she stood in front of Judge Holloway, a man who saw this case as nothing more than an opportunity to remind the world who held the power. The prosecutor, Daniel Wexler, was as slimy as they came, a man with a permanent smirk and a sharp tongue, skilled in the art of bending the truth just enough to secure a conviction. He thrived on cases like this, cases where the odds were already stacked in his favor. Dressed in an expensive navy suit, he stood beside the judge, flipping through the case file with calculated ease. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "the facts of this case are indisputable. The defendant not only resisted lawful arrest but also made baseless accusations against officers who were simply doing their jobs." Jasmine's lawyer, Monica Everett, sat stiffly beside her, her hands clenched into fists. Monica was one of the few attorneys willing to take cases like this, but even she knew the reality of the situation. This wasn't about evidence. It wasn't about truth. It was about control. Judge Holloway leaned forward, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Miss Carter, I must say, I find it quite interesting that you expect us to believe that these highly trained officers with years of experience, would target you without cause." His tone was laced with mockery, his amusement barely concealed. Jasmine met his gaze, unwavering. She had seen men like him before. Men who believed they were untouchable, men who wielded their power like a weapon. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that she had been watching him just as closely as he had been watching her. For months, Jasmine had been investigating something much bigger than her own case. She had uncovered secrets that tied Judge Holloway to a network of corruption that reached far beyond this courtroom. And in this moment, as he sat there so sure of his own invincibility, he had no idea that his empire was already beginning to crumble. The walls of the courthouse felt tighter, the air heavier with the weight of what was coming. Because Jasmine wasn't just another defendant. And this wasn't just another trial. The game was about to change. And Judge Holloway was about to learn what it felt like to be powerless. The courtroom had settled into a quiet hum, the weight of inevitability pressing down on everyone present. Jasmine Carter sat motionless, her hands still cuffed in front of her, her expression unreadable. The voices around her droned on, Judge Holloway reveling in his authority, the prosecutor weaving a narrative built on lies, and the officers sitting smugly on the sidelines, waiting for the moment she would be led away, another victory in their long history of unchecked power. But she wasn't just another defendant. And today wasn't just another trial. Monica Everett, her defense attorney, exhaled slowly, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had been in courtrooms like this before, had fought against this exact type of corruption for years, but something about this case felt different. She wasn't just defending a client, she was fighting against something much bigger than herself. The odds were insurmountable, the system was rigged, but Monica knew something Judge Holloway didn't. Jasmine had let them believe they had already won. Judge Holloway leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the desk as he stared at Jasmine with thinly veiled amusement. "Miss Carter, before I deliver my ruling, I'm willing to give you one last chance to admit your wrongdoing. Perhaps show a little remorse for what you've done." His smirk widened as he glanced at the jury, then at the reporters scribbling notes in the back of the room. "It might lighten your sentence." Jasmine finally looked up, meeting his gaze with a calm that sent an almost imperceptible shiver down his spine. "Remorse?" Her voice was even, measured. "You want me to apologize for being beaten in the street? For defending myself against corrupt officers? Or is it that you want me to apologize for not staying quiet?" The tension in the room thickened. A few whispers spread through the audience, the weight of her words hitting harder than Holloway expected. He frowned, his grip tightening on the gavel. "You are dangerously close to contempt, Miss Carter." She tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes never leaving his. "And you are dangerously close to the truth." The room went still. The prosecutor, Daniel Wexler, cleared his throat, stepping forward with a carefully crafted smirk. "Your Honor, I think we've entertained Miss Carter's theatrics long enough. The facts are indisputable. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the officer's testimony, and her attempts to shift the blame are," Jasmine's voice cut through his like a blade. "What if I told you that the evidence you're so confident in is a lie?" Monica inhaled sharply beside her. This was it. Wexler blinked, his confidence wavering for the briefest second. "Excuse me." Jasmine leaned forward, her hands still cuffed, but her presence commanding. "What if I told you that this entire trial is built on fabricated reports? That the officers who arrested me have a documented history of excessive force, complaints buried under piles of red tape? That their body cam footage conveniently went missing before this trial?" Wexler's face tightened, but Judge Holloway recovered first, his voice sharp. "You don't get to rewrite the facts in my courtroom, Miss Carter. The only truth here is the one that the law recognizes. And according to the law, you assaulted officers of the state, resisted arrest, and falsely accused men who risk their lives every day to keep people like you in line." There it was. That slip, that slight crack in his mask. "People like you." Monica felt the word slap against her like a cold gust of wind. The whispers in the room turned into murmurs, a few reporters exchanging glances, their pens moving faster. Jasmine nodded slowly, letting his words hang in the air. "People like me." The silence stretched. Judge Holloway straightened in his seat, regaining his composure. "Regardless of your attempts to distract from the facts, Miss Carter, this trial has reached its conclusion. The law must be upheld, and in this courtroom, justice." Jasmine's voice was softer now, but deadly sharp. "Is that what you call this? Justice?" She turned her gaze to Wexler. "Prosecutor Wexler, do you even believe the words coming out of your mouth? Or do you just enjoy winning?" Wexler scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Miss Carter, this isn't a debate stage. The evidence is clear, then present it." His breath caught. She waited, her expression steady, while the entire room shifted. The cameras in the back zoomed in, the audience leaning forward, hanging on to every word. Jasmine tilted her head, watching him carefully. "Where's the full footage of my arrest? Where are the unedited bodycam recordings? Surely, in a case this straightforward, you would have nothing to hide." Wexler's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Holloway cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "That is not how this works, Miss Carter. You are not the one conducting this trial. I will not tolerate this level of," Jasmine cut him off, her voice sharper now. "But you will tolerate corruption, won't you?" A ripple of movement spread through the room. For the first time, Judge Holloway looked unsettled. Jasmine exhaled, sitting back slightly. "This case was never about me resisting arrest. It was never about justice. It was about silencing me before I could expose the truth. And the fact that none of you expected me to fight back." She let a small, knowing smile cross her lips. "That's your biggest mistake." Judge Holloway slammed the gavel down, his voice a sharp bark. "Enough. I have had enough of your accusations, your theatrics, your disrespect for this court. You will not stand here and undermine my authority." Jasmine's gaze never wavered. "And you will not stand here and pretend you are above the law." A moment passed. Then another. The tension coiled tighter and tighter, ready to snap. Judge Holloway's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his papers, attempting to compose himself. "This trial is over. I am ready to deliver my ruling. Jasmine leaned forward one last time, lowering her voice just enough for only the front row to hear. "You might want to think twice before you do that." And just like that, the air in the room shifted. Something was coming. Something they hadn't planned for. And none of them were ready. The tension in the courtroom had reached a suffocating level, an oppressive weight that pressed down on every person present. The room, once filled with quiet murmurs and calculated glances, had now become an arena where the very foundation of justice was being tested. Jasmine Carter remained seated, her hands still bound by the cold steel of her handcuffs, but there was no defeat in her posture. If anything, there was an undeniable shift in the air, something subtle yet immensely powerful. Something that those in power had not anticipated. She had let them believe they were in control, had let them savor their assumed victory, but that illusion was now beginning to shatter, piece by piece. Judge Richard Holloway, the orchestrator of this entire charade, sat atop his bench, gripping his gavel with a force that made his knuckles turn white. The flicker of unease in his otherwise unwavering demeanor did not go unnoticed. For years, he had ruled this courtroom with an iron fist, delivering sentences with a smirk, knowing full well that his decisions would never be questioned. He was a man accustomed to absolute power, a man who had built his career on the careful manipulation of the system. And yet, in this moment, in the face of Jasmine's unshaken resolve, something unfamiliar settled in his chest. A feeling he had not encountered in decades. Fear. Beside him, Daniel Wexler, the prosecutor who had crafted this case with meticulous precision, attempted to maintain his usual air of confidence. But there was something in his eyes, something hesitant, uncertain. He could sense that the narrative he had so carefully woven was unraveling before him. He straightened his tie, cleared his throat, and attempted to regain control. "Miss Carter," Wexler began, his voice carefully measured, his words deliberate. "Your continued defiance will not change the facts of this case. The court does not operate on baseless accusations, and unless you have substantial proof to support these outlandish claims, this trial is over." Jasmine tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words, as if weighing the gravity of what she was about to do. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind that made even the most composed individuals shift in their seats. And then, with deliberate calm, she spoke. "Proof." Her voice, though soft, carried through the room with a force that made the walls seem to close in. "You want proof?" The air seemed to still as she slowly turned her gaze toward the doors at the back of the courtroom. The reporters, who had been hunched over their notepads, suddenly became statues, their pens frozen mid-sentence. The audience, many of whom had resigned themselves to the expected conclusion of this trial, now found themselves on the edge of their seats. The anticipation was electric. And then, she gave the command. "Bring it in." The heavy wooden doors swung open with a resounding thud. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a hammer striking metal. A collective gasp rippled through the room as several figures entered, their movements deliberate, their presence undeniable. Dressed in dark suits, their expressions unreadable, their pace unwavering, they strode forward with a confidence that commanded attention. Federal agents. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. Judge Holloway's fingers twitched around the handle of his gavel. Wexler inhaled sharply, his posture stiffening, his hands clenching into tight fists. The officers who had fabricated the charges against Jasmine exchanged glances, their previously smug expressions faltering. The balance of power in the room had shifted in an instant, and for the first time since the trial began, those who had orchestrated this injustice realized they were no longer the ones in control. The lead agent, a tall black man with a presence that demanded respect, stopped in the center of the room. His gaze, cold and unwavering, landed directly on the judge. His voice was even, steady, but carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "We have new evidence to present to this court." Every eye turned toward him. Every breath in the room was held. The agent reached into his briefcase, retrieving a thick file filled with documents, photographs, and sealed transcripts. He held it up, letting the weight of its contents be known before setting it down on the prosecution's table with a heavy thud. Wexler flinched. The agent did not break eye contact with Holloway. A full investigation into the corruption within this courthouse, he continued. Illegal rulings, manipulated evidence, suppressed testimonies. And, Judge Holloway, he let the name hang in the air, each syllable carrying the weight of finality, you are at the center of it all. Gasps erupted from the audience. Some whispered in shock, others turned to one another in disbelief. The reporters, previously still, now erupted into motion, their fingers flying over keyboards, their cameras clicking frantically, capturing every second of this historic moment of reckoning. Judge Holloway's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He grasped at the remnants of his authority, but the power that had once shielded him had vanished. This is preposterous, he finally managed, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. This is a courtroom, not a circus. These accusations are baseless, the agent remained unmoved. We have documented proof. He lifted a USB drive, its small, unassuming size carrying enough evidence to dismantle an empire. Emails. Wire transfers. Phone calls. All linking you to judicial bribery, case tampering, and a long-standing history of racial bias in sentencing. Your career has been built on corruption, Judge Holloway. And as of now, it is over. The words slammed into him harder than any gavel ever could. The courtroom became a storm of chaos, reporters shouting, cameras flashing, spectators murmuring in shock. The very walls seemed to shake under the weight of what had just been revealed. And then, the agent spoke the words that would seal Holloway's fate forever. Judge Richard Holloway, you are under arrest for obstruction of justice, judicial misconduct, and conspiracy to pervert the course of law. The air in the courtroom became unbearably heavy. The gavel that had once held so much power fell from Holloway's grasp, clattering uselessly against the polished wood. The officers who had once stood in smug confidence were now silent, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the exits. For the first time in his life, Holloway was powerless. The bailiffs, his own bailiffs, stepped forward, placing the cold weight of handcuffs around his trembling wrists. The very symbol of authority that he had wielded so freely was now used against him. The once mighty judge, the man who had spent his career condemning others without hesitation, was now led away as a criminal. Jasmine inhaled, steady and deep, victorious. But this wasn't just for her. This was for every innocent person he had wrongfully sentenced. For every voice he had silenced. For every life he had destroyed in the name of power. And as Richard Holloway disappeared through the doors of his own courtroom, the walls that had once protected him crumbled. And Jasmine Carter? She was finally free. The courtroom was in chaos, an eruption of voices, camera flashes, and gasps that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. The once commanding figure of Judge Richard Holloway now stood in complete disgrace, his hands bound in cold steel, his body rigid with humiliation. The man who had spent decades wielding absolute power was now powerless, the weight of his own corruption pressing down on him like a crushing force. His face had lost all color, his lips slightly parted, as if still searching for some way, any way, to reverse what had just happened. But there was no way out. The system he had manipulated, the laws he had twisted, had finally turned against him. Jasmine sat still, watching it unfold, the weight of vindication settling deep in her chest. For the first time since she had been dragged into this nightmare, she was the one who held the power. It was a feeling so rare, so foreign in courtrooms like this, that the sheer reality of it almost didn't seem real. But it was real. The evidence had been delivered. The truth had been exposed. And Holloway, the untouchable man who had built his career on the suffering of others, was finally facing the same system he had weaponized for years. Wexler, the prosecutor who had stood so confidently at the start of this trial, had paled significantly. He turned toward the federal agents, his voice shaky but still clinging to the last remnants of composure. This is highly irregular. You can't just barge into a courtroom with, the lead agent, his posture steady, his voice unwavering, cut him off. We can. And we just did. His cold stare landed on Wexler, piercing through whatever illusion of control the man still thought he had. You knowingly pushed a case built on fabricated evidence. You argued in favor of officers with a history of excessive force and misconduct. Either you were complicit or you were negligent. Either way, you failed. A visible shudder ran through Wexler's body. He hadn't seen this coming. Not like this. He had been too confident, too sure that Jasmine was just another case, just another person they could silence. But now, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him. Jasmine finally spoke, her voice even, controlled, but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut through the tension. Tell me something, Wexler. Was it worth it? Was this worth throwing your career away? He turned toward her, eyes flashing with something, anger, resentment, maybe even regret. You think you've won, he said, his voice low, almost shaking. You think this changes everything? She leaned forward, her expression unreadable. No, Wexler. I know it does. Holloway, who had remained silent up until now, finally snapped. His voice, once booming with authority, came out in a sharp, desperate hiss. This is a setup. This is a political stunt. His wrists twisted in the cuffs, his once pristine suit now wrinkled with sweat. He turned toward the lead agent, his face contorted with fury. You have no right to humiliate me like this in my own courtroom. The agent remained unfazed, his gaze unwavering. No, Judge Holloway, he said, voice calm, steady. We have every right. You humiliated yourself. Holloway's breathing turned erratic, his chest rising and falling in sharp, panicked movements. He turned wildly toward the jury, as if searching for anyone who would stand up for him. You people don't understand what's happening here, he spat, his words dripping with resentment. You're watching a good man get destroyed. You think you're all so righteous. You think this is justice. His eyes locked onto Jasmine, filled with pure venom. You did this. You think you've exposed something. You think you're some kind of hero. This isn't over. Jasmine tilted her head slightly, taking in his downfall with quiet observation. It is for you. Holloway's breath caught, his face twisting into something ugly, something unrecognizable. His downfall had been swift, public, and absolute, and the realization of it was finally sinking in. He turned toward the officers who had once stood beside him, his allies, his enforcers, but even they looked away now. There was nothing left to save him. The lead agent turned toward his team and gave a simple nod. Take him. The movement was instant. The federal officers stepped forward, firm hands gripping Holloway's arms as they began leading him toward the exit. His protests echoed through the room, but they carried no weight anymore. His reign was over, and everyone knew it. The reporters surged forward, their questions firing off in a chaotic blur. Judge Holloway, do you have a statement? Were you aware this investigation was happening? What do you have to say about the allegations? His head whipped toward them, his rage boiling over. This is a witch hunt. A disgrace. You're all just, but he never got to finish. Because in that moment, as he was dragged through the doors, the courtroom erupted into something Jasmine never expected. Applause. It started slow, hesitant, from a few members of the gallery. Then it grew, spreading through the room like a wave, as more and more people rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, crying. Some had been victims of Holloway's rulings, others had simply witnessed injustice for too long. But all of them knew one thing, they had just witnessed history. Jasmine turned to Monica, her lawyer, who was watching the scene with something close to awe. She had fought battles in courtrooms like this for years, had lost more cases than she cared to admit, but this? This was a victory unlike any other. "You did it," Monica whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Jasmine, you did it." Jasmine exhaled slowly, her hands flexing as she finally felt the weight of the cuffs being removed. The cold steel left red marks against her skin, a reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. But now, she was free. Not just from these chains. Not just from this trial. She was free from fear. As she rubbed her wrists, she turned toward the jury, toward the gallery, toward the people who had stood by and watched, some in silence, some in outrage, some in hope. And then, she lifted her head and spoke one last time. "This wasn't just about me. It was never just about me. It was about all of us. And if today proved anything, it's that the system only wins when we stop fighting back." The room erupted again, louder this time, voices rising in cheers, fists lifting into the air. Because they understood. This wasn't just Jasmine's victory. It was theirs. And for the first time in a long, long time, justice had truly been served. The courtroom had finally begun to empty, but the energy of the moment still lingered in the air, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Reporters whispered in hushed tones as they packed up their equipment, their faces still stunned from witnessing what was sure to be one of the biggest legal scandals in decades. Some members of the audience remained frozen in their seats, unable to process the sheer gravity of what they had just seen, a judge, once untouchable, being dragged away in handcuffs. Jasmine sat still, her body heavy with the aftermath of the battle she had just fought. The cuffs had been removed, yet the ghost of their weight still clung to her skin. Her wrists were raw, faint red marks serving as a reminder of just how close she had come to losing everything. Freedom. Her reputation. Her future. But the reality had flipped in an instant, and now it was Holloway who faced the crushing weight of justice, who would sit in a cell, stripped of the power he had so ruthlessly abused. Monica stood beside her, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the empty judge's bench, as if waiting for some final confirmation that it was all real. Her voice was quiet, but there was an unmistakable edge of relief beneath it. "I've spent years in this system, Jasmine. Years fighting cases just like yours. And not once, have I ever seen it fall apart so perfectly for someone like him." Jasmine exhaled, her fingers drumming softly against the table in front of her. He thought he had control. He thought he'd already won before this trial even started. But power built on lies was never going to last forever. Monica nodded, though there was something unsettled in her expression, something that Jasmine immediately picked up on. "What is it?" The attorney hesitated, shifting her weight before lowering her voice. "Wexler. He might not have been arrested today, but he's just as guilty. He helped build this case knowing it was fabricated. He let Holloway pull every string to make sure you went down for something you didn't do. And now? He just gets to walk out of here, wipe the sweat off his forehead, and move on to the next case." Jasmine followed Monica's gaze, landing on Wexler, who stood a few feet away, his usual confidence shattered. He was staring at the empty judge's chair, his hands buried in his pockets, his face drawn and unreadable. Jasmine didn't feel anger when she looked at him. She didn't feel hatred or even triumph. What she felt was something heavier, something more complicated. She saw a man standing at a crossroads, his career in shambles, his choices finally catching up to him. She had seen men like him before, men who played the system because it was easier than fighting it, men who justified their actions with the excuse that they were just doing their jobs. And now, he had to live with the truth, he had backed the wrong side. She stood, ignoring the stiffness in her legs, and walked toward him. The sound of her footsteps made him turn, his shoulders squaring out of reflex, as if preparing for a confrontation. But Jasmine didn't lash out. She didn't yell or accuse him of anything. Instead, she just looked at him. "You knew," she said, her voice even. Wexler swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the floor before settling back on her. I followed the case. The evidence, it was solid enough to prosecute. Jasmine let a slow breath pass through her lips. Solid enough, or just convenient? His jaw tensed, his composure cracking. You think I wanted this? His voice was quieter now, more strained. You think I woke up in the morning and said, let's take down an innocent woman today? That's not how it works. Then how does it work, Wexler? She took a step closer, watching as he shifted uncomfortably. How does a prosecutor convince himself that what he's doing is just another day at work? That another life ruined is just part of the system? He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. You think this is easy? You think we get to pick and choose our cases? The second I would have questioned anything, the case would have been handed to someone else, someone who wouldn't have hesitated to bury you. Jasmine studied him for a long moment, reading the conflict in his eyes. And that's the excuse you tell yourself at night so you can sleep? His lips pressed into a thin line, his silence answering her question. Monica had approached by now, arms crossed, watching the exchange with a hardened expression. People like Holloway don't get away with things like this without help, she said, her words sharp. And you were part of that help. So tell me, Wexler. Are you just going to walk out of here and pretend none of this ever happened? His fists clenched, tension radiating from his stance. You don't get it. If I admit to my part in this, my career is over. Jasmine let that sit for a moment before tilting her head. And if you don't? Silence. Because they all knew the truth, his career was already over. He could stay in the system, keep his head down, act like this trial was just another unfortunate incident, but he would never outrun what had happened here today. The weight of that reality settled over him, his face hardening before his shoulders finally sagged. His voice was quieter now, almost reluctant. What do you want me to do? Jasmine didn't hesitate. You know what I want you to do. Wexler looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable passing through his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned toward the media still lingering in the room. A reporter caught his movement, eyes widening as she scrambled to grab her mic. Prosecutor Wexler. Do you have a statement? For a second, he hesitated. Then, he took a deep breath and stepped forward. Yes. I do. Jasmine and Monica watched, waiting. The weight of what was about to happen next wasn't just on him anymore. It was on all of them. The courtroom wasn't just a place where a corrupt judge had been exposed. It was now a place where the system itself had been put on trial. And the consequences of that moment were only just beginning. The courtroom had transformed into something else entirely. What was once a space dictated by authority and rigid control had now become an arena of shifting power. The air still pulsed with the weight of what had just happened, of a system cracking in real time, exposing its rotten core to the world. Jasmine Carter stood in the center of it all, the storm around her swirling with reporters, lawyers, and government officials who had once dismissed her as just another case, just another name on a docket. But now, no one could ignore her. No one could pretend that this hadn't happened. Wexler stood at the front of the room, his chest rising and falling as he faced the wall of reporters, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had spent his career behind the podium, delivering carefully curated statements, standing before the press with well-rehearsed confidence, spinning narratives in favor of the system he served. But this moment was different. He was different. He had never stood on the other side of a scandal before. Never had he been the one under scrutiny, the one whose next words could either save or destroy him. Jasmine watched as he opened his mouth, hesitated, then finally forced the words out. I built my career on the belief that the justice system was fair, that our courts operated on the foundation of truth and integrity, he said, his voice steady but laced with something raw, something vulnerable. But this case. He exhaled sharply, his gaze flickering toward her, then back to the cameras. This case proved me wrong. A murmur spread through the crowd of journalists. Camera flashes went off in quick bursts, pens scratched feverishly against notepads. The audience, many of whom had watched this trial unfold with silent disbelief, leaned forward, hanging on to his every word. Monica folded her arms, her expression unreadable. Jasmine, standing just a few feet behind Wexler, studied the back of his head, the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breath hitched between sentences. This was a man unraveling, a man standing at a crossroads, knowing that whatever he said next would define him forever. The truth is, Wexler continued, I prosecuted this case knowing that the evidence had been questionable. I followed the lead of a judge I trusted, a judge who I now know was deeply corrupt. I stood in this courtroom and defended officers who did not deserve to be protected. I argued against a woman who should have never been here in the first place. His voice wavered slightly before he caught himself. And for that, I was wrong. The room shifted. Jasmine felt it, felt the slow turning of the tide, the murmurs of the gallery changing from whispers of curiosity to gasps of realization. This wasn't just an admission. This was a confession. One of the reporters pushed forward, voice sharp, demanding. Are you saying you knowingly prosecuted a case built on false evidence? Wexler swallowed hard. The muscles in his jaw tightened. For a brief moment, he glanced back at Jasmine, something unspoken passing between them. He knew what he was doing. He knew what it meant. Yes, he said, the single word landing like a hammer. I did. The room erupted. Shouts rang out from every direction. More questions. More chaos. The reporters pushed forward, their voices clashing, demanding follow-ups, demanding details, demanding to know what happened behind closed doors. Monica let out a slow, measured breath beside Jasmine, her arms still crossed. Damn, she muttered, shaking her head. He actually did it. Jasmine didn't move. She just watched as Wexler stood there, taking the storm head-on, no longer the prosecutor in control of the narrative but the man caught in it. Another reporter's voice cut through the noise. Do you believe other cases under Judge Holloway's rulings should be re-examined? Wexler hesitated. He had to have known this question was coming. He had to have known that this wasn't just about one case. Finally, after a long pause, he said, yes. The word rippled through the room. Monica inhaled sharply. Jasmine's hands curled into fists. This case isn't an isolated incident, Wexler admitted, his voice quieter now but no less impactful. If one case was built on corruption, then there's reason to believe others were too. And if that's true, then we have a responsibility to investigate. To fix what's been broken. The words hit like a shockwave. This wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. This was bigger. The system had been exposed, laid bare in front of the world. And now, there was no putting it back together the same way. Jasmine stepped forward. So what happens now? The room stilled. Wexler turned to her, something shifting in his eyes. He looked different now, not defeated, but unmasked. The man who had once stood across from her in court, so confident in his ability to bury her beneath the weight of the system, was now standing beside her, facing the same storm. We start digging, he said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. We find out how deep this goes. We don't let them sweep this under the rug. A slow, rising murmur passed through the audience. The reporters scrambled for more questions. The cameras turned back to Jasmine, as if waiting for her response. Monica leaned in slightly. They're waiting for you to say something. Jasmine exhaled. For so long, she had been fighting to survive, fighting just to prove that she didn't belong in that orange jumpsuit. And now, she was standing on the other side of that battle. The chains were off. The weight was lifting. But the war? The war was far from over. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces watching her, waiting. The people in the gallery, the journalists, the activists, the silent observers who had spent years believing justice would never come. Then, she spoke. "None of this ends today," she said, her voice steady. Holloway was just one man. Wexler was just one prosecutor. But this system has been built to protect people like them. And if today proves anything, it's that they can be held accountable. The room hung on to her every word. Jasmine took a breath. This isn't just about me. It's about every single person who has ever been told to take their sentence and accept it. About every person who has ever been told that fighting back is pointless. This is about all of us. And I don't know about you, but I'm not going to stop fighting now. A moment of silence. Then, the room erupted again. This time, it wasn't just reporters shouting. It was cheering. It was hope. And for the first time in a long, long time, Jasmine could finally breathe. The noise in the courtroom had begun to subside, but the energy of the moment remained. The walls, once suffocating with the weight of corruption and oppression, now carried the vibrations of something else: reckoning, accountability, justice in its purest and rawest form. People lingered, unwilling to leave, unwilling to let the moment slip away as just another headline, another news cycle, another instance of injustice that would be acknowledged and then forgotten. But this wouldn't be forgotten. This couldn't be forgotten. Jasmine stood still, her pulse steady, but inside, she felt everything shifting. It was like standing in the eye of a storm, calm at the center but aware of the chaos that still surrounded her. Holloway was gone. His reign over this court was finished, his grip on power ripped away in a matter of minutes. The same system he had manipulated, the laws he had twisted, had turned on him. But his removal was just the beginning. Monica was beside her, arms crossed, her sharp gaze analyzing everything. "You realize what this means, right?" she murmured, her voice just low enough for Jasmine to hear. "This isn't just one case. This isn't just Holloway. You've opened the floodgates." Jasmine inhaled deeply, her mind already racing ahead. "I know." Monica tilted her head toward the exit, where reporters were still clamoring for more, their cameras trained on Wexler, who was now the one under scrutiny. "He's not walking out of this clean. He admitted to knowing about the corruption, to being part of it. His career is over, whether he realizes it or not." Jasmine studied Wexler's posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he kept his gaze fixed ahead, refusing to let his expression betray what was clearly breaking inside of him. She could almost feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him, the reality that his entire identity as a prosecutor had just crumbled in real time. He had spent years defending the system, upholding it, convincing himself that even if it wasn't perfect, it was better than the alternative. And now, that illusion was gone. She stepped toward him, slow, deliberate, her voice even. "What happens next?" Wexler exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. He looked exhausted, his entire body language one of defeat, of someone who had just walked through fire and barely made it out the other side. But there was something else in his expression too: resolve. "I don't know," he admitted, shaking his head. "I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I was doing the right thing. But now," he laughed, but it was hollow, almost bitter. "Now, I don't even know who I am." Jasmine didn't let him look away. "You still have a choice." Wexler frowned, his brows furrowing. "A choice? You can walk away, pretend this was just a mistake, something you regret but can't change," Jasmine said, her tone steady, unwavering. "Or you can fight. You know how deep this corruption goes. You've seen what happens behind closed doors. If you really want to make it right, then do something about it." His jaw clenched. He wanted to argue. She could see it in the way his hands curled into fists, in the way he grappled with the weight of his own guilt. But he couldn't argue because he knew she was right. Monica spoke up, her voice sharp. "Holloway was just one part of this. There are more like him. More prosecutors, more judges, more officers who've used the law as a weapon instead of a shield. If this court has a history of wrongful convictions, of biased sentencing, then we have to dig deeper. Wexler let out a slow breath, looking around the room. The press. The activists. The victims of the system who had sat in those chairs just like Jasmine had, waiting for a verdict they knew had been decided long before they arrived. He met Jasmine's gaze again, something shifting behind his eyes. You really think anything will change? His voice was quiet, but the doubt in it was real. Jasmine didn't hesitate. It already has. A long silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, Wexler turned, pushing through the remaining reporters and walking toward the exit. He didn't answer any more questions, didn't try to justify himself. He just left. Monica exhaled, shaking her head. Do you think he'll do the right thing? Jasmine watched as the doors closed behind him, the echoes of his footsteps fading into the distance. I don't know, she admitted. But I think, for the first time, he's actually asking himself that question. The room had emptied more now. The chaos had died down, but the reverberations of what had happened here today would last far beyond these walls. The media would keep running the story. Investigations would spread. Other victims of Holloway's courtroom would come forward, demanding their own cases be re-examined. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Jasmine felt a presence beside her, a soft inhale of breath before a familiar voice spoke. I knew you wouldn't go down without a fight. She turned and found Detective Marcus Reynolds, standing with his arms folded, his usual easygoing smirk replaced by something deeper, something heavier. Marcus had been one of the few people on the force who had always tried to push back against corruption, but even he had been forced to work within a system that didn't want to change. Jasmine's expression softened slightly. You kept tabs on the trial? Marcus scoffed. Please. This was the only thing anyone in law enforcement was talking about. Half the department is trying to pretend they didn't know how bad it was. The other half? He tilted his head. They're scared, Jazz. Because if a judge like Holloway can go down, it means none of them are untouchable anymore. Jasmine absorbed his words, her mind already working through the implications. Good. Marcus studied her for a long moment before nodding. You did the impossible today. But you know they're going to come for you, right? There are still people in power who don't want this to go any further. They'll try to discredit you. Make you look like the villain. Maybe even try to bury this before it spreads too far. Jasmine had already considered all of it. Let them try. A slow grin pulled at the corner of Marcus's mouth. That's what I thought you'd say. The weight of the day settled in her bones, exhaustion creeping into every muscle. But even through the exhaustion, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. She had survived. She had fought back. And for the first time, she had won. Marcus let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. So what now? Jasmine looked around the emptying room one last time, letting the events of the day settle fully in her mind. Then, she met his gaze, her voice steady, clear. Now. We keep going. The aftermath of the trial rippled through the system like a shockwave, leaving no one untouched. It was no longer just a scandal, it was a reckoning, a moment that demanded accountability. The courthouse, once a symbol of unchecked power, now stood at the center of something much bigger. Reports flooded in. Investigations expanded. More names surfaced. Judges. Prosecutors. Officers who had built their careers on corruption, manipulation, and oppression. The walls that had once protected them were crumbling, and for the first time, the people on the inside were scrambling to escape the collapse. For Judge Richard Holloway, there was no escaping what came next. He was stripped of his title, his power, his legacy reduced to a disgraceful stain on the justice system. The same courtroom where he had delivered so many unjust rulings now became the stage for his own downfall. His trial was swift, the evidence against him undeniable. Bribery. Case manipulation. Racial bias in sentencing. Each charge stacked upon the next, crushing him under the weight of his own actions. He sat in a defendant's chair, hands folded, silent for the first time in his life, while the world he once controlled decided his fate. In the end, his sentence was harsher than even he had anticipated. Decades behind bars. He appealed, of course. Men like him always did. But every attempt was met with the same unwavering truth: the system no longer belonged to him. Daniel Wexler, the prosecutor who had once been so sure of his convictions, had made his choice. His public confession had ensured that his career was over, and before long, he resigned from his position entirely. But he didn't disappear. Instead, he turned informant, exposing everything he knew about how cases had been twisted and manipulated. His testimony became a catalyst for wider reforms, a key piece in dismantling the network of corruption that had existed in the shadows for far too long. He would never be the same man again, and maybe that was for the best. For the first time in his life, he was finally telling the truth. Monica Everett thrived. Her name became synonymous with justice, her firm growing in influence as she took on case after case, reopening trials of those who had been wrongfully convicted under Holloway's rulings. She worked tirelessly, relentless in her pursuit of undoing the damage that had been done. The world saw her as a defender of the people, a force unwilling to yield, and she embraced it fully. This was why she had become a lawyer in the first place. As for Jasmine Carter, her story did not end in that courtroom. She didn't just walk away from the case, she became the face of change. Interviews, news specials, legal panels, her name became known not as a victim, but as a fighter, someone who had taken on the system and won. She could have taken the settlement offers, could have quietly walked into the shadows and tried to put it all behind her. But that wasn't who she was. That wasn't why she had fought so hard to survive. Instead, she dismantled everything that had once tried to destroy her. With Monica by her side, she worked to overturn convictions, to give a voice to those who had been silenced, to make sure that no one else ever had to sit in a defendant's chair the way she had, knowing that the verdict had already been decided long before the trial even began. She fought not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told that justice wasn't meant for them. And the system? It had no choice but to listen. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was winning. Now, take a moment to think about what this story really means. How many times have you seen injustice happen and felt powerless to stop it? How many times has the system failed people who never stood a chance to begin with? Jasmine Carter's story isn't just about one woman fighting back, it's about what happens when you refuse to stay silent. When you refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Because the truth is, power only exists as long as people allow it to. So ask yourself, if you were in Jasmine's position, what would you have done? Would you have fought, knowing the odds were stacked against you? Would you have taken the risk, knowing the system wasn't built to protect you? Or would you have accepted it, let it swallow you whole, convinced that nothing would ever change? The next time you see injustice, in any form, in any place, remember this story. Remember that silence is the greatest weapon of oppression, and the only way to break it is to speak, to fight, to stand up even when it feels impossible. And if this story left an impact on you, if it made you feel something real, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. Here, we tell stories that challenge, that provoke, that remind you that justice isn't always given, it has to be taken. Because the truth, it's always waiting to be revealed.